You're listening to Breakpoint This Week, where we're talking about the top stories of the week from a Christian worldview. Today we're going to talk about a dust-up over restrooms on Capitol Hill and what the transgenderism debate has to do with the way we see ourselves as human beings. We're also going to talk about the food conversation, how our food is produced, and whether we should change that. So we have a lot to get to today. We're so glad you're with us. Stick around. Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. John, I want to jump right in because this week there's been a dust-up, if you haven't been paying attention, about the restrooms on Capitol Hill. There is a congressperson from Delaware who is a man who presents himself as a woman and wants to use the women's restrooms inside Congress, in government buildings. And then there is a congresswoman from South Carolina, Nancy Mace, who has authored a bill specifying that you have to be a woman to use the women's restroom and you have to be a man to use the men's restroom. And this has created all sorts of controversy because that's the moment that we're living in. But it's also been kind of a fascinating exploration of, you always talk about these "you are here" moments, showing where we are as a culture. And I think it was yesterday that this congresswoman who's been very bold, Nancy Mace from South Carolina, on this issue, she shared that she was sexually assaulted herself, and this is a women's safety issue and that kind of thing. She also kind of doubled down yesterday with her support of the LGB community, maybe we'd put it. I supported the Respect for Marriage Act, so-called, which was the 2021 bill that codified that we've now changed the definition of marriage to include same-sex pairings. And that was, to a lot of people, myself included, that felt really inconsistent. So have you been watching this whole controversy dust up?
I have been paying attention. This isn't a topic that just to be clear, we talk every week on how to not talk about this topic on this program, right? Because it feels like it is one of the central stories of our age, and it's not a fun thing to talk about over and over and over and over and over. We have a series on a Breakpoint commentaries where we're going back and looking at 2024, and we've picked out 6 of those "you are here" moments. And the story about this particular issue, the stories about this particular issue made that list of what I think is a defining thing to know about in terms of where we're at in this cultural moment. But mostly it had to do with the fact that the ground seems to be shifting. Things seem to be changing. The inevitability of this issue a year and a half ago, in particular, probably a year and a half ago, that has changed. And that has had a lot to do with, the science coming out. That's had a lot more to do with courageous individuals. I think this is a incredible example of the spiral of silence in play, where people were shamed into saying anything. We talked, what was it, just a couple weeks ago about that CNN segment where somebody basically tried that tactic and it didn't work like it did in other times and in other places. And that's a fascinating thing to watch. You have parents that finally have said, "I'm not comfortable." You have dads showing up at school board meetings. You have certainly the detransitioners. These are the victims, the most direct victims of these ideas that were in their moments of confusion, according to their own words, fast-tracked into some sort of affirmation is the word that's used of their confusion and, things being flipped on the head. This is a fascinating kind of bookend to this conversation, not only because here it is, it's coming at the end of 2024, not only because you had a Speaker of the House come out just unapologetically and say, "Look, I'm going to be as clear as possible. Men are not women, women are not men." And, and all us parents are like, yes, I'm having that same conversation with our children. Hey, by the way, kids, men are not women, women are not men. And it's really important that we do that in a time of confusion. But we have a real crisis of consistency, and it betrays this kind of worldview issue. Now, I'm not talking specifically about Nancy Mace. This is an example. I don't know anything really about her. I don't know anything about her story or her claims to faith or whatever. It doesn't seem like she's coming from a religious background at all and being so just kind of front and center on this issue. As you mentioned, it seems to have to do from her own situation of vulnerability and being abused and saying, look, this is a real risk. And we know that's the case. There's been enough of those stories that have leaked out from Target restrooms, who were one of the first kind of early adopters of this madness. I guess at some level, I'm not kind of accusing her of being inconsistently biblical, where I don't know that she should have any, reason to be to begin with. But there are way too many examples of this, including the entire GOP platform, right? So here you have the entire GOP coming out and supporting this. Good for them. But the platform is inconsistent on the fact that men are men and women are women when it comes to the most essential relationship of society, which of course is marriage. And consequentially, the second most, or the same like unto the first, which is the relationship between moms and their kids and dads and their kids. As we've said a number of times here, moms don't dads, dads don't mom. There's something distinctly different about men and women, which of course is at the root of this whole conversation. But we've got this thing in law, and this is part of the relationship between law and culture. And now we have it in state laws across America as well, saying that men and women are interchangeable when it comes to marriage. And if men and women are interchangeable on the most essential role, it's really difficult then to turn around and say, well, men and women aren't interchangeable in a specific geographic location, like a bathroom or a changing room or a restroom or, women's sports. And so we have a group of people doubling down on, saying things that are just even more absurd, like, oh, there's really no, differences when how hard you can hit a volleyball or, how hard you can throw a punch between men and women. But we've already said that about marriage and family, and you can't accept that and then say this downstream and then pretend that there's no inconsistency. And this is the worldview crisis, I think, at the root of this. The confusion about who gets to use what restroom is downstream from a deeper issue, which is us believing at the end of the day that our maleness and our femaleness are essential aspects of our creation and not just mere constructions of our imagination and will.
Yeah, I think like you that this, we joke about getting tired of talking about this, and I share that. But I think the reason we talk about it so much is because of how fundamental the questions underneath this issue are. Because essentially, I see connections here to even the conversation around so-called assisted death or medical assisted dying, which is becoming more and more of a front and central issue for a lot of people, especially in Canada, because the underlying question is, what are our bodies? And, underneath that even is, what are we? Because if you look at your body as a lump of whatever matter, and it's just for you to do with what you want, and the real you is just something ephemeral we call consciousness or self or whatever, Sam Harris wants to think that it is, then it's hard to come up with an argument why you shouldn't be able to do whatever you want with that body. And then if you support that, the autonomy argument, you do whatever you want with your body, you can't also hold at the same time that your body is fundamentally important, that it was made in a certain way for a certain purpose. And really, the argument against calling homosexual pairings marriage needs that. It requires you to say bodies are important. The way bodies are made is specific and has a role. And that's one of the fundamental reasons why this, same-sex relationship is not marriage, because it's not procreative in essence, like the essence of it is not. And that has tendrils. That argument goes all the way to what Nancy Mace is dealing with and what, this trans issue has been for ages now.
Yeah. And it's not just that bodies matter, but that bodies are integral to who we are. They're not just shells. And,
right.
This is something that was really, in a sense, unthinkable, even though you had all kinds of philosophical, histories to a dualism. In practice, it was really impossible to live as if our bodies didn't matter because we didn't have the technology to manipulate them. We didn't have the surgeries. We knew that death to body meant death to self in a very real sense, from the number of things that could kill us, at one point. You can see some of this in Blaise Pascal's wonderful ruminations. And I resurrect my endorsement my recommendation probably 7 times on this podcast to go back and read Pascal's Pensées, particularly the ones on what it means to be human, because he has this insight on this. And we treat the body as if it is an essential part of who we are. But you got to the core of it. And I was thinking a lot about this morning. And part of this conversation for me has to do with what's happening in Colorado Springs over the last 2 weeks, which is we're right around, I think, the 2-year anniversary of the Club Q shooting. Mm-hmm. And the Club Q shooting was this gay nightclub, you might remember, and a horrific event. A number of people died. And in all the reporting leading up to this, until a report of a lawsuit. So follow this. On all the reporting, it was repeated over and over and over. It's a hate-filled crime, a bias-motivated crime. And the shooter did plead guilty to that as a way of avoiding the death penalty. So it was part of his plea agreement to plead guilty to hate crimes. There's still federal hate crimes that are pending, and there are plea deals and agreements going on with that. So this was said over and over and over again. And then on, I think it was Monday, there was an article announcing that there was a lawsuit, a wrongful death lawsuit and a negligence lawsuit filed against the city, filed against the owners of the Club Q nightclub, and the city council members, I think, by the family members and some of the victims at that shooting. And as part of that, to say that there's a negligence here now adds cause, right? It actually adds other factors, because they're arguing, and they have to argue, that he was a known threat. And he was a known threat. And the police did fail in this, and the red flag laws did fail in this. But he was a known threat because about a year before the shooting, he said he wanted to be the next mass shooter. He didn't specify where. He didn't specify hate for a particular community. And in that year, he visited Club Q about 7 times. So he knew about the lacks of security. And he now identifies as non-binary. So all of this kind of throws questions about this, right? It throws doubt, all this. Now, what does this have to do at all with this bathroom deal and all of that? Because, listen, we always go back to this framework of reality, this worldview framework, which begins with 2 chapters, creation and fall. And if you miss creation in any way, then the downstream consequences of that create confusion. In other words, if who we are as human beings are fundamentally creations, that means there are givens. That means there are things that are actually fixed, unchangeable, that we're not just self-constructions. We can't just ignore the givenness, for example, to your point, of our bodies, and then say that, and then later on claim those givens. Right? This is the inconsistency happening right now. And honestly, again, I want to go back. I have no reason to think that Nancy Mace should be consistent. I have no idea who she is. She may or may not, claim Christianity or whatever else. But Christians should have that consistency.
Well, but I agree with you, but just really quickly, also just biologically and scientifically, it's reasonable to be consistent, even if you don't have the word of God underneath you. Like, bodies are bodies. That's observable.
But that's the second chapter. That's the Romans 1 part of the fall, right? Where the Romans 1, look, Paul's just flat out clear. Things are evident. In fact, what's yes. evident, right? Hold on, but there's more. Wait, there's more. Things are evident about the creation that tells us about the creator. That's chapter 1 in Romans 1. Chapter 2 is, and we suppress the truth by our wickedness, right? And listen, both of those things are normative for the human condition. That's what Pascal gets so right. Both of those realities, that there is a givenness, and it is obvious. And if we miss the obvious, it's not because it's not obvious. It's because we made it not obvious in our wickedness. So I'm granting that category for Nancy Mace, right? And it is a statement, by the way, that as somewhat, or at least partial products of our culture, as all humans are, that culture can move us so far away from reality that we can say things that are fundamentally nonsensical. Or in our case, going back to this reporting of the story of Club Q and reporting of this, of all the bathroom stories and this whole thing. Not just nonsensical, but more accurately, narcissistical. And I'm not saying this in some sort of like harshness or beline this terrible tragedy that took place in our city 2 years ago, or the really hard mental health struggles that individuals have. Narcissism is fundamentally saying whatever I think needs to become the truth about all of reality, and everybody else needs to conform about it. Or expressive individualism, a form of this on a cultural level, says the most important thing we have to do is to demand who we are to everyone else, and everyone else's most important job is to conform to our vision. And this has taken on just unbelievable. I mean, can you imagine going back just 20 years ago and saying this would be the dominant conversation of our culture?
It's strange.
I don't think people would believe it, right? 20 years ago? Because some of these givens were still so much in place. But that's Romans 1 about the fall, is that we deny these givens enough that we separate ourselves from reality and literally become deluded. And so Proverbs talks about sin making us fools, making us foolish, making, us embrace folly, which is, of course, seeing the world morally upside down. And not just morally upside down, just, I guess, biologically upside down, relationally upside down, socially upside down. It goes on and on and on. This is why I think Christians, to be truth tellers, can't just kind of do the whack-a-mole, I got to tell the truth about this or tell the truth about that. The importance of going back and building a worldview from the ground up has never been more important, in my view.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, John, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Breakpoint this week.
Hey, this is John Stonestreet from the Colson Center, and I want to invite you to consider attending the Colson Center National Conference next May 30th to June 1st in Louisville, Kentucky. One of the things that Chuck Colson said that I've been coming back to over and over and over is his observation that the most important thing that the world needs right now is for the church to be the church. A lot of times we look at what's happening in the broader culture and we can't believe our eyes. We can't believe how things are changing so quickly, how things that were unthinkable a generation ago are unquestionable today. And we wonder, what is it that we can do? Well, Chuck said, way more important than what we can do is who we're going to be. And as a former colleague said, the church is God's plan A, and there's not a plan B. So I think it is time that we remember who we are and what it means to be a follower of Christ. It's not just to be an isolated individual Christian. It's to be part of the church. And the church has a clear calling in Scripture to engage the cultural moment for which it's been chosen. And for us, like it or not, that's this one. And we're going to be joined by a fantastic lineup of speakers, including Dr. Carl Truman, Rosaria Butterfield, Scott Klusendorf, Dr. Farr Curlin, and of course, many, many more. Again, the dates are May 30th to June 1st in Louisville, Kentucky for the Colson Center National Conference, Be the Church. To learn more, go to colsonconference.org. That's colsonconference.org. And if you register by November the 30th, you'll get a 50% discount off the cost. Again, colsonconference.org.
We're back on Breakpoint this week. John, we were joking in the last segment that we feel tired of talking about some of these existential, like physical realities stuff. So we're going to talk about something now that we don't usually talk about. And I'm excited to get your take on this because we're not going to talk about the sort of bingo game of nominations for various cabinet positions under President-elect Trump, even though that has been fascinating to watch from a political point of view.
Oh, man, fascinating. Wow.
Fascinating.
But we're not going to do it.
But we're not
going to do it.
We're going to restrain ourselves. There is one nomination, though, RFK Jr., that I want to talk about, which, by the way, as an aside, The Rest is History is just finished up a series about the assassination of RFK Jr.'s father. And it is a fascinating. I think one of the hosts of The Rest is History did his thesis on it or something. It was fascinating. Anyway, he has really jump-started a conversation about food, and this has jump-started all sorts of other conversations as to the role of government in things like our food supply. There's questions of whether this whole, Fruit Loops are poisoning you, is that a conspiracy theory or is this worthwhile? What should we expect from the government? A lot of people are pointing out that, Republicans and conservatives were the ones who, 8 or 12 years ago were pushing back against Michelle Obama for asking for better nutrition. And isn't this hypocrisy if they now support this? I have my own take on that. But what's your, last week I joked with you about Jack Phillips, the new challenge coming for him was the sugar police, because we know, of course, I'm kidding. But what's your take on this? Is this a good thing?
Well, it is a thing. I think that's the first and most notable thing is that it's a thing.
You are here. Food conversation moment.
Listen, like it or not, we're going to have a national conversation about food.
Totally.
And it's already started and it's bipartisan. So, that's the kind of grand temptation here, right? About somebody like RFK Jr. in this particular appointment. Now, at some point, we're going to have to come back and revisit over and over again. There was a fascinating, and this is we've both snuck in early recommendations before our recommendation segment.
Okay.
You just did it again.
The rest is history. Yeah.
The rest is history, and I'm going to do it with a First Things article that was written this week about the precarious position of the pro-life movement right now, and it's interesting because it's written, not by, a never Trumper on the right or anything like that. It's written by a British pro-lifer who says he owes so much. The movement there owes so much to the pro-life movement in America. And now what do we do with somebody who's going to be over a department like HHS who has been so not pro-life like RFK Jr.? And that'll be something we'll come back to over and over and over because we have to see where this plays out. And there are real concerns that are legitimate about, what it means now to operate under a completely different set of or without the political alliances that we once had. We're going to set that aside for right now, although, that's an interesting part of it. And there's the political interest about how RFK Jr. got this amount of influence and power, which was very clear. This was a political exchange for an endorsement. His endorsement meant an awful lot because it brought in seemingly some individuals who wanted to have this conversation about food and thinks that this conversation about food is the most important, issue. And let me go back to something else. It's bipartisan. That's what's so interesting about this. Not that Bill Maher is fully representative of the left, but he featured a conversation, which is fascinating. You can never recommend his program because there's far too many bad words and crass language and jokes that are thrown into it. But he had a woman who has written a book.
John, look, I have it in front of me. It's called Good Energy by Dr. Casey Means. She's the one I was talking about last week when I brought up Jack Phillips and sugar, but go on.
Well, you should just give my wife a call and you guys can have a conversation about Dr. Means. So the fascinating part about it in this conversation is here you have people both on the left saying, look, this is a conversation we need to have, and it's a conversation that needs to have on the right. Now, there's more details than this, but again, Michelle Obama at least tried to initiate this conversation a couple years ago while she was first lady, and Governor de Blasio, if you remember that, tried to ban supersized sodas in New York City, and it became an issue of freedom. This is fascinating, and I'm not going to get into policy because I don't know nearly enough to do any of that, but there's going to be layers and layers and layers upon this conversation. For example, one of the things that was very accurate in terms of what Dr. Means said on the segment in Bill Maher's program, which will be part of this conversation, is food production. What it has to do with pesticides and plastics, but also enhancements, right? Which has been a part of increasing food production at an incredible rate. That has come along with real concerns that people have with what's in our food. The challenge is, in the last 3 decades, the global abject poverty level around the world has been cut in half. And one of the big reasons it has been cut in half, especially starvation level, and we've been able to deal with famine, is because of the modification of our food sources and making them far more productive, especially rice. One of the foods she highlighted as being bad is white rice. That has kept an awful lot of people from starving to death. And so part of this conversation we need to have, or we will have, is the fact that we're having this conversation is because we're in the West. and because we're now post some of this stuff. So that's part of it. The other part to me is far more interesting, which is the worldview framework. We go back to creation, fall, redemption, restoration, and particularly our created relationship with the rest of the world. And listening to this conversation basically was a conversation about what it means to be human. That was so fascinating about this little segment. By the way, did you see that segment between Dr. Means and Bill Maher? Did you watch some of it?
Yeah, I did.
So there was, first of all, conversation about what it means to be human. Are we just a set of parts or a set of functions? And medicine has moved in that direction, where medicine, by and large, Western medicine is catastrophe control, essentially, or catastrophe mitigation, where you have a bunch of specialists. And this specialist tells you this, and this specialist tells you this, but they all talk like experts.
What they're telling you is take this medication, right? It's incredibly siloed. So
oftentimes,
she was an ear, nose, and throat surgeon, and she talks about she's doing sinus surgery after sinus surgery after sinus surgery, and starts trying to ask, why are all these sinuses inflamed? And everybody she asks is like, stay in your lane. You're here to do this surgery, and that's it.
Right. But see, that's all predicated on a question of what it means to be human. So in an overly naturalistic understanding of the human person when it comes to health and medicine, then you treat humans as a collection of body parts. And that's the way it seems. And by the way, that's why it's so remarkable. We also have to acknowledge that even if we think this form of medicine or this way of thinking about humanity is fundamentally mistaken or misguided at a fundamental level, which I do, it still increased the life expectancy for the most of the 20th century and into the 21st century at a level that, medieval man would have never imagined. Now, what we've had since then is a decline. We've talked about this decline in life expectancy, and especially in the West. The conversation about food is going to involve, is it because of these poisons, plastics, pesticides, how the formation happens, the manufactured sugars, all the other things that's part of our food? And the answer is probably yes. But you know what the other problem is that we're on our screens, and that's associated with mental health and depression, and we spend too much time inside, which you also mentioned. So we all have this incredible vitamin D and other deficiencies. But beyond that, we have these deaths of despair. We have the breakdown of civil society and the breakdown of the family and the isolated individual and the epidemic of loneliness. And that's a comorbidity, to some of this stuff. What she's positing is we're whole people. We have to see this stuff we have to see people as being whole. And I think that has been a deficiency in medicine. There's no question. So these conversations are going to be multi-layered. And at the end of the day, they have to do with what it means to be human. Are we a set of parts? Are we wholes? Are we part of communities? Are we individuals? And so on.
So it's fascinating that was the impression that you take away from her discussion with Bill Maher, and for good reason. I mean, this book is partly about food, but certainly not completely about food. However, it is also fascinating reading the book and getting a sense of her worldview, because she at times sounds as if she truly believes, I doubt she'd say this, but she truly believes that it's possible to live forever. And if we had the right alchemy, like if we did the right combination of things, that's what we would do. And some of the stuff kind of veers. Every once in a while, she says something really hyperbolic in here about how, I'm just a collection of atoms that's made up of organic material, and I'm going to return to that. And so I shouldn't, ingest things that aren't organic material, stuff like that. That's honestly just fascinating to observe, because she is drawing some really good conclusions, though. It's one of those things. You get the sense reading this book that she is coming to some of the same conclusions that we do, but from the other end, from sort of the natural law end. She's saying, she's looking at I can see the scientific data that shows me now how we were supposed to live. We were supposed to be in movement, much more movement than we currently are. We were not supposed to be indoors. We don't function as well physically and physiologically and mentally when we stay at 70 degrees Fahrenheit for our entire lives. We were built for temperature fluctuation. There's some weird things in here, but it's real, and then of course the food is a big conversation. And so she's got a lot of research on the way chemicals interact with our cells and the way our cells multiply and all that kind of stuff. But she really is you can hear her trying to understand, like, there's a difference between not dying as our only metric of success and living well. And she's leaning towards the side of living well means thriving in comfort, where your body's systems are not slowly decaying because you're poisoning them slowly, but they're functioning well. And basically you feel better. My husband keeps joking with me because I'm reading this book. He's like, Maria, you're reading this and making all these changes, and you're going to be like 57 and have a heart attack, and I'm going to live until I'm 90. And, and I said, you know what? Even if that's true, I will feel so good those 57 years.
There
I'm
you
going
go.
to enjoy every second of it.
My wife and I have that same conversation.
But I want to say something too about the food supply and the starvation thing, because that's absolutely true.
Can I address that before? Because what you just said is really important, and we'll come back to the food supply stuff, because that's fascinating too. Because again, there's so much about this conversation that is, look, other times and in other places, they're not even having it, mostly because they don't have any sort of food supply.
Isn't it fascinating too that this is the same conversation we're having with Jonathan Haidt? Like,
completely. It's completely
all these secular people are like, oh my gosh, we're bodies as well as minds, and we are not attending to our bodies to our detriment, from technology, food, all this. Yeah.
Right. But the part of this conversation that emerges apparently in her book, which I haven't read, but clearly in this conversation, is that all this comes down to this fundamental question, what it means to be human. And that's why I think we have seen a tale of confusion of what was predicted in previous decades, of this shift that the Western world made to a naturalistic worldview, where religion, spirituality, anything metaphysical was seen as being personal, private, imaginary, not really essential, not really real, the fact-value split that Francis Schaeffer talked about, and all that sort of stuff. That there were real consequences for our understanding of what it means to be human. And it only makes sense if you're confused upstream that it's going to lead to all these confusions downstream. That's what our first segment was all about, a confusion about what it means to be human. This is the same thing. And I was fascinated in her conversation because, she didn't get into the we can live forever stuff in this interview. What she did get into was not flirting with that, which is transhumanism, but flirting with pantheism in that interview, where she talks about RFK talking to ravens and being in touch with nature.
That's what I'm saying.
And that we're just one of them. Now listen, and I've come back to this about 4 times in the last 4 weeks because of being introduced here in Francis Schaeffer's little book on the church, to just a basic way of thinking about worldviews. Naturalism seeing it, the world as a closed box where everything, including us, is inside the system, right? Now, in practice, that resorts to this, strongest survive, who's the biggest eater Darwinian framework that we've now imposed in there. And so we can see the world as a place that we can master, that we can control. This is, Friedrich Nietzsche's madman, where if God is dead, we all get a promotion, or we all have to assume that position. This is the pushback that she's doing. It's like, we can't see the world as, this sort of place. But what she turns around and offers, which a lot of people do in the ecological movements, and also here, and this is going to be a big part of this conversation that we're going to have to figure out how to get around. We're not the same as animals. We're not the same as our food. And when you see the world as a closed box, you're seeing us as basically being just nature. And what that does is create another problem, right? And you quoted her here. You represented her as saying, we weren't supposed to be inside this much. We weren't supposed to be sitting around. Where does supposed to come from?
I find myself arguing with her so many times, because she'll say things like, our bodies are incredible. They evolved over whatever many years, because we were outside and we were hunter-gatherers, which of course begs the very obvious question. Then why aren't they evolving to adjust to our new sedentary inside life? Like, by your reasoning, right, we'll adjust to this. And you can't argue that.
And you know what? If your view of this goes back beyond the last 40 or 50 years, right? Which this conversation that we're having is about 30, 40 years old, of dealing with really the hyper kind of imposition of all these things that we've done to increase our food supply and other things. But you have basically the story, and sorry, I'm trying not to make too many connections here, but this is absolutely connected to the climate change catastrophism vision, right? Where if you think the world is on the precipice of disaster, which you should believe if you're a Darwinian, then one little thing we do can screw the whole thing up and it can just fall apart. Or you think that the world was designed, and when designers make a machine, they create redundancies, they create safety valves, they create all pressure releases and all kinds of things so that there's a way of adjustment. The story of the world that we see is that there are abilities of the human body to adjust, but not because we've evolved that way, because God made us that way. And so I see in this conversation, and by the way, I'm fascinated with it. Again, I don't have any reason to expect she should be consistent with, the Genesis 1 to 3 account of the human condition, but she is smuggling in, and that will be part of this larger food conversation, so many different worldviews in this, right?
She's going to be fascinating to watch, because even in this whole like Adam's conversation, because there's no way she's incredibly brilliant. She's got to evolve. Like, she's not a vegetarian.
She's got to evolve.
But how
pun
do you,
intended.
no, sorry, pun intended. She's not a vegetarian, but I don't know how you aren't a vegetarian. If you see the only reason she's not is because she knows how important it is for our bodies that we eat animal protein, but she doesn't have a good worldview argument. If we're all just atoms and we're all here to, whatever, then how can you argue we're better than animals?
You've made her more fascinating to me by introducing the transhumanist conversation.
You've got to read her book.
Well, I probably won't, but I will pay attention. There's been a lot of transhumanist conversations in this kind of mastery. And I know a lot of Christian men and women who have really, captivated this idea of like, what if we could live to 125 or 140? And to me, this is a mix of motivations. There's a good motivation of trying to overcome the fall. If the biblical account is indeed accurate, which I believe it is, as the fall continued to work out post-Genesis, one of the things you saw was declining life expectancies, right? So, you have that genealogy in Genesis where it's like, and this guy lived to be 900. And who was the oldest? This is Bible trivia, man. If you grew up in a Baptist church, you know the answer. Methuselah, how old?
900.
Yeah, it's 900 and something. I'm thinking 972, but somebody's going to write us and correct that.
Something like that.
But so you get it to decline to the point where, the psalmist, is it in the Psalms where it's like God has ordained for man? Yeah.
Help me number my days. Yeah.
And for most of, pre-medicine, the pre-scientific world, that life expectancy is now down into the 50s, 40s. I see this as a conflict of, what is it for Christians? How do we have our worldview consistent? Death is not the enemy. Death is not to be feared. God holds the keys to life and death. We're going to live as long as he wants us to live. Is it okay to push back on life expectancy in the way, as a way of reversing the fall? We think that to live in this chapter of humanity between redemption and restoration is to push back on the fall and be a part of God's reconciling process of all things. But the impulse to live forever can absolutely come into conflict. I mean, you talked about this after COVID. The fear of death over all other fears drives you into strange things. Now, for what's her name again?
Casey Means.
Means. Okay. A friend of mine brought this up years ago, talking about worldviews. It's like most people don't have a worldview, WORLD. They have a worldview, WHIRLED. In other words, we're a mix of all kinds of different ideas. It's like, a big whirling set of views. This is what comes in my estimation, from her, who's really trying to follow the truth. It seems like, and a big part of her story is that she felt like she got gypped in her medical training, right? Where she was taught in this way of doing it. It's going to be a confusing conversation going forward. And it's going to be fascinating.
She's on a journey, and I think she's too smart. She's too smart to stay where she's at. Like she'll have to make some conclusions, and it'll be interesting to see which those are. What barriers she's got in front of her. But I think the bigger impact on her life, according to the book, was the death of her mom, and kind of understanding how there were clear metabolic issues leading up to her mom's death that American medicine was so specialized that they missed, or that nobody was. The incentives are not in the system right now to approach health from like a longevity perspective. It's just we symptom manage, basically, is her argument.
Yeah, and a lot of us have had that experience, right? I mean, you've had that
100%.
experience. We've had that experience with our kids, and it's frustrating. Yeah. It's like, and part of it's just scale, and we're at the same time as we're frustrated with the process. There's a process in place that would have been unthinkable in all of human history.
I know, but this is where I want to take this, because this is a directly worldview applicable problem. Now, we talk all the time about anytime there's a new technological advancement, being the people, the church especially, but being the kind of people who stop first and say, should we do this? Even though we can, should we? And there are all sorts of examples of us not doing that. So look at the way we talk about the internet now. There's a very good case to be made for how much better the internet has made life, or how many people it's helped or even lifted out of poverty. We can talk to anybody in all corners of the world now, and we couldn't do that before. At what expense, right? There's a lot of expense. I'm not prepared to say it's a net good or a net bad, but we know there are trade-offs that we didn't consider, either because we didn't want to or we couldn't before we put this into place. The same is absolutely true for the way we make food. So it is true that people have been lifted out of starvation, which is an unequivocal good. But what are the expenses of that? I don't think we knew before we went into mass food production. I don't think we fully know now, but I also know that a big train going in this direction is much harder to turn around than it would have been to stop in the first place. And we have more and more data coming out now showing us how dangerous some of these processes are. And it's incredibly difficult to stop. And so it is one of those like technology conversations we have to have about trade-offs, because the thing is, yeah, we can create rice and preserve it, on a shelf for much longer than we ever could before. And that has lifted people out of starvation. But what has the way we're doing it now, what other solutions might we have found to that problem that we're not motivated to look for because we've got this easy thing in place doing it now?
I could fully agree that that's the confusion that I'm talking about. I just don't think it's an easy math problem. When the AI robots take over the universe and bring the apocalypse and all the food supplies disrupted as they try to starve us off, you're going to wish you had some of that rice on your shelf. And so's Aaron. And he's going to be like, I told you to at least save some of that rice so that we have something to eat.
When COVID happened, I literally doomsday prepped rice and children's Tylenol. That was just where my brain went. And we still are eating some of that rice water? Because I went for it. No, I didn't. Okay. I was like, we'll dig a well. I don't know where my brain was at. But listen, there are things like, for example, under the Food and Drug Administration, there's a designation called generally recognized as safe. It's GRAS, generally recognized as safe. It's a designation that goes on conventionally sourced food. So like fabricated food products that go into, that have preservatives and either pesticides or hormones or whatever it is. The companies responsible for deciding whether or not a food can have the GRAS designation under the FDA are the companies manufacturing the food. There's no oversight. These are the kinds of things, I understand the argument about Michelle Obama was being heavy-handed, the whole you can't have a supersized soda thing. I actually still think that was really condescending and weird, because what was happening there was an attempt by governmental officials to tell people what individual choices to make. You shouldn't eat this, or you shouldn't eat this much of this. What we're talking about now, I think with RFK, is we should have more safeguards in place as to how this food is mass produced. I shared this analogy with you yesterday, but I've been thinking about this a lot. If you're about to go fly on a plane, this is the difference between saying the government should have a regulatory structure that makes sure planes are manufactured safely and that there's safeguards in place for each part. Right? There's got to be some standard of regulation over what parts can go into a plane and how much testing they have to have beforehand. What Michelle Obama was trying to do was to tell every American, you can only fly to this city on this day and you should only fly in this kind of plane. Those are two very different things theoretically and from a worldview angle. And sure. I think the conversation about how things are made and produced is very worthwhile.
Well, look, I don't disagree with any of that. And I said they weren't the same. It's just fascinating to see the bipartisan nature of this conversation in a way that wasn't possible or wasn't happening just recently. And there's all kinds of explanations for that. What's going to continue to plague this conversation, though, which we're having, like it or not. I mean, maybe we'll come back a year from now and say, well, we never had the conversation after all, and something happened or whatever. I think this is going to be
We're having it at
really
my house.
Interesting.
No more Eggo waffles.
If your husband needs to call me for some peace and quiet.
He really does.
Yeah.
Whatever. Oh my gosh.
But my simple point is there's going to be other ideas about life in the world that shape this conversation. For example, the idea that the problem is the bureaucracy or the corruption in the bureaucracy. So the way to fix it is by other bureaucracy. This is again, goes to the second chapter of the biblical story and the fall. If we mitigate the way we've tried to control and master the universe by seeing humans as just, part of creation in some sort of pantheistic sort of way, then, and underestimate the resiliency of humans to adjust and to build the world because God literally gave them that capacity, then we're going to, fall down in a different way. I think there's no question that this is part of that larger conversation of what we can do versus what we should do, and even having good motivation of feeding a lot of hungry people. And it's more than just that. I mean, listen, we're at a place that the world's never been at before, where the idea, for example, that we can predict the weather and change for it, this is so recent. Hurricanes are coming. You don't get 3 weeks notice. You don't get any sort of, building codes. I mean, we see this when there's a mudslide or something in other parts of the world. There's a resiliency we've been able to build into the human experience that was unthought of, on all kinds of levels.
We've also lost a lot of natural ability. I mean, people were able to tell a hurricane was coming by much more natural means, maybe not as effective or as quickly. But no, that's a real argument.
I'm talking on a mass scale. Maybe, there's, the guy
enough.
who can put his ear to the ground and smell the lilies and figure this out.
His joints are aching.
Listen, when I say we've mitigated starvation, I don't just mean a few people have been saved. I mean, we're in a completely new era of human history where we can actually feed an awful lot of people in a way that has never been done before. And we also know that that's come along with bureaucracy and corruption in a way that's created different miserable conditions for the people who were under miserable conditions, right? So this is the idea of understanding the fall. And what will plague this conversation is this new idea, we can fix this. We can fix this. And if we have that, we're just, what G.K. Chesterton's line is fascinating to me. There's a lot of ways to fall down. There's only one way to stand up straight. And, there's going to be a little Weeble action happening, in how we try to deal with these problems. And I'm not, you seem to think I'm complaining about this. I'm fascinated by this conversation. I'm going to watch it. And it's rooted again in what it means to be human.
Have you heard the term biohacking?
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's who I'm talking about. I know. I want you to write a column on the use of that term, because that is the worldview implications are dripping from that term. I think biohacking is a really interesting term and a really fascinating conversation because of what people mean by it. They essentially mean you can figure out what your body needs and give it to it in like a shorter, more efficient way, aided by technology.
Sure. We're just going to have a conversation about Western medicine because we rely on Western medicine, and we are still going to rely. I'll close with this. I'm grateful that 25 years ago, I was introduced to, in the Worldview conversation, which at the time was all about the existence of truth and the meaning that was having because of the tail end of the existentialist philosophers and so on, and the nihilist questions about moral relativism, which were front and center in the conversation. There was a handful of thinkers I came across, thanks to Ben Mitchell, who was my advisor at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, who said the big conversation is on the question of identity, the question of humanness. And he introduced me to about 70 different ways that conversation was going to affect the work of mission and the church's witness in the modern world. This, I admit, the food conversation was not one of them, and I did not foresee this 25 years ago, but it's still part of the same conversation of identity. I'm thankful for that. And I'm also grateful. And it's Thanksgiving, so let's talk about what we need to be thankful for. I'm thankful, again, for guys like Farr Curlin, because at the time I started thinking, I think medical missions in the 21st century is not going to be just, Doctors Without Borders or going into foreign countries and using medicine as a way to share the gospel, although it still is, and God bless the work that so many people do in that space. But there is a form of medical missions that has to do with fundamental ideas. The pre-evangelism that Schaeffer talked about in so many ways in the worldview stuff absolutely applies here. And thankfully, we've got people that are asking those questions, and we need more. And maybe if you're a student and you're trying to figure out what to study and how God can use your incredible intellect for his glory, this is one of those. Go join this kind of conversation on what it means to be human, whether we're talking about AI or whether we're talking about medicine. We need Christians in all those different spaces. And by the way, the biggest driver of the food conversation are the entrepreneurs and the business and the investors and those that are, driving this because of the market. And we need them as well, because that is what has brought a lot of good to the world at the same time. And what does it mean to do that ethically is a great conversation we need to have.
The biggest drivers of the food conversation are the moms. I'm staking that claim.
Well, now they are. Yeah.
John, you mentioned this in our last segment, but we are a week out from Thanksgiving. So do you want to talk about things that we're thankful for? Is that too
I think Thanksgiving is a wonderful worldview conversation, and it's a great opportunity to have a conversation with your kids and family and others, and to show a different way of life. And part of that has to do with what we talked about in segment 1, which is this kind of framing about life around expressive individualism, the narcissism, the celebration of so-called pride. I had this conversation recently. You and I talked and endorsed the idea of Fidelity Month in June as an alternative. You remember that? And the reason is that was such it wasn't just a, pride is bad sort of conversation and, sexual deviancy is wrong sort of thing. It's basically showing, when people see faithfulness, fidelity, when people keep their word, when you hear the story of a dad. You remember that during the hurricane in North Carolina, the dad that walked like 40 miles because just to get to his daughter's wedding? Mm-hmm. Everyone loves those. Or when you see an old couple holding hands walking down the street, right? Mm-hmm. And everyone loves that because that is an expression of something that is good. And we know it's good. It's touching into that part of us that God put into the world that even though we reject and deny, when you see it, you love it. I think thankfulness is the same way. Thankfulness turns us outward, and everything else in life turns us inward. So I think it's more than just kind of going around the table and saying thanks. I think, I was thinking that through this whole conversation. I wanted to thank Ben Mitchell, right? Because this whole conversation has been what it means to be human, what it means to be human about food, what it means to be human in relationship to the rest of creation, what it means to be, body and soul. And that was a conversation that was such an essential part of my worldview formation. And I thank Ben Mitchell for that. I really do. He influenced me on that in a really profound ways. And then other people did as well. But gratitude does that, right? It turns you outward. And everything else in life right now in our culture is turning us inward.
That's really good. So this week I was listening to, at the advice of my husband, a sermon from Alistair Begg called Overflowing with Thankfulness. This is part of his Truth for Life podcast. This was part 1 of a series, and he was talking about the difference between, I think he called it gracious gratitude and natural gratitude. Natural gratitude is what kind of arises out of a good circumstance or comfort or pleasure or beauty or whatever, and all things definitely worthwhile to thank God for and to be thankful for. And then gracious gratitude, he talked about being really the true mark of a Christian and what sets us apart from others, which is the gratitude that can only come from recognizing the intrinsic goodness of God's character. And this happens, he shared a long quote at the end of the sermon from Jonathan Edwards' wife after he died unexpectedly after receiving a smallpox vaccine. She wrote a letter to their daughter kind of saying, the whole letter read like a psalm. It was just, our God is good. He is steadfast. He is full of graciousness and mercy. And he has taken my husband before I thought he would, but now what a legacy we have as a family, and he gets to be with Jesus. And that to Alistair Begg is an example of gracious thankfulness, which is just, thankfulness that erupts from things that the world or even our fallen, nature would not think to be thankful for.
That's a great, Begg is so good on those things, and it's a great distinction because I think you have seen certainly an incredible decline in both of those forms of gratitude, and that goes to the power of culture and cultural norms when it feeds our entitlement. When you're entitled, you're not grateful. I love that line from G.K. Chesterton. He said, "If I know who to thank for the gifts under my in my stocking on Christmas morning, who should I thank for being able to put my own feet in my stockings every other day of the year?"
Yeah.
And he also, of course, called gratitude, the kind of the queen of the virtues. Chuck, I had this conversation this week with a mutual friend of ours, and he was reminding me of how important that line was to Chuck Colson. And, one of the last projects that Chuck and a group of individuals did is a series on ethics called Doing the Right Thing. And it was all about how we have a moral breakdown in society and how do you rebuild morality, because it wasn't just the result of moral relativism. It was also the collapse of virtue formation. In other words, not being formed in virtue. And one of the things that Chuck would point to is the role that gratitude plays in that. In other words, recognizing how much of our life is given to us that's not our own, how much of it has been passed down, and ultimately how every good and perfect gift comes, from above. And I think about that, especially around Thanksgiving time. And, this was a much more pronounced, I think, contrast or example 10 years ago or 15 years ago at the height of Black Friday early shopping, when stores went from opening at 7 to opening at 6 to opening at 4 to opening at 2 to opening on Thanksgiving Day at 7 o'clock. And there were those rushes and all that sort of stuff. And it was such a crazy, contrast of spending a day giving thanks, quote unquote, and then trampling security guards for flat screen TVs the next day. And it's just like, that is a cultural habit that tells way more about our values than taking the day off and gorging ourselves with, way too much food. And there's a difference between celebrating with food and, not, using it differently. I had this conversation, honestly, with Dennis Prager once in a panel that I was a part of. I think it was me and Dennis Prager and Steve Meyer. And I was just grateful to be in the room. And I used that example, and Prager was like, "Are you kidding me? That's a great thing that we want to go and give gifts to each other at Christmas." And I'm like, dude, I just don't agree with you. Like, I don't think the people that are trampling security guards and getting in fistfights, they're doing this out of the spirit of Christmas. This is a cultural level of entitlement. And I do think that we have this kind of marker in the sand called Thanksgiving. And it's a good thing. But how we talk about it, what we do with it is really, really important, right? Because it's so countercultural today. There's so many parts of our world that turn us inward. And gratitude is a profound recognition. Now, I think Begg's distinction there is really helpful. And that's, I guess, what I'm calling for. It's not just kind of the, to the waiter, thanks for bringing me my food, but it's really your job, sort of thing. But choosing to see, choosing to pause, and the habits that are required, to truly recognize the source of all good gifts and how that forms us as individuals. It just seems to be one of those things like fidelity that is just in stark contrast. I've really been fascinated, something else Chuck Colson said, that Christians don't impose, we propose a better way. And could something like Fidelity Month, could something like how we do Thanksgiving and gratitude be something so profoundly countercultural to change the world and move the world, as Chesterton also said, instead of being moved by the world?
Yeah, that's really cool. Well, John, we shared a lot of recommendations already this show. We've got Blaise Pascal. We've got some Chesterton. We've got The Rest is History. Dr. Casey Means, maybe-ish, if for no other reason than the fascination of her worldview. Do you think we can call it there? We've gone a little bit over time.
We have.
Still have a recommendation?
I get one. You. Okay. I only did 2. You did like 5, so I get one more.
Okay, fair enough. Go ahead.
But it's really important. And another sense of maybe countercultural stuff is duty. Like, what does it mean to actually think about calling and how that applies to the cultural moment? And this is, I think, the weekend of the release of the Bonhoeffer movie, right? And this is a profound story. It's really amazing. There's been a handful of really kind of small little pictures done on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer's theology is fascinating to me because it was so connected with the incarnation. And it went all over the place. There's no question about it. One of the things that I'm thankful for was Eric Metaxas's biography of Bonhoeffer. It has a lot of criticism, and I don't take any of that seriously. I think as a biography, Eric gave the world a gift by pointing back to Bonhoeffer at a time that we didn't realize at the time was so critical. And the incarnational kind of what he called the tempest of the living and the sort of decision-making that requires ethically was a good reminder at a time where we weren't having to make some of those hard decisions. And we can see a time from here where we might have to make some really hard decisions. And I just think that it's a great hero's story. And so I haven't seen the film, but the folks that are behind it are wonderful people who want to bring good things to the world. And so I would say go see Bonhoeffer. That's my recommendation. Even if I haven't seen it yet, that's the plan.
That's a risky move. Okay. Well, that's going to do it for our show this week. Thank you so much for listening to Breakpoint this week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Baer, along with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center, and we'll see you all back here next week.